Dust clung like a fever to the sun-bleached boardwalk, coating every surface from hitching posts to the rickety steps of the auction block. A crowd pressed close, their boots scuffing splinters and planks, their harsh voices rising with each bid. At the center stood Clara Johnson. 16 winters cooled into hard eyes, her small frame swaying beneath the weight of her newborn brother tucked against her breast. She wore her mother's shawl frayed at the edges, and every heartbeat she felt his tiny ribs pressed to her chest. On this day, in a lawless town starving for coin and spectacle, she and the child were the merchandise. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special saved just for you. Sheriff Tom Miles, straight-backed and dour beneath his badge, rasped the auctioneer's chant. Going once, going twice. Clara's cheeks, ghost-pale as the infant's cotton bonnet, burned with shame she refused to shed. The townsfolk leered. Children darted among their legs, and a breeze from the western hills carried the tang of manure and sour whiskey. Clara closed her eyes against the noise, pressing the baby's cheek to her own in a silent vow that no harm would come to him while she had breath to give. A sudden hush rose like a tide crashing on a distant shore, when a lone figure materialized at the back of the crowd. He came on horseback, a wide-brimmed hat low over eyes tired and weary, a long duster streaked with dust from the prairie. His saddle creaked as he dismounted, spurs chiming a slow refrain. The auctioneer waved a gavel and barked. Highest bidder? The man's voice cut to the murmur. I am... Murmurs broke among the onlookers. Some spat, others whispered curses. Clara opened her eyes, squinting through half-light to see the stranger sliding a leather satchel onto the block. The sheriff's gaze flicked from the rancher to the sheriff's ledger. The rancher unlatched the bag and shook coins with deliberate calm. Each coin glinted like a cross at high noon. Clara's heart hammered as the auctioneer counted 1, 2, 3, then pounded the gavel. Sold, he growled. To the rancher, hands trembling, Clara slid from the platform. The baby's small fist clutched at her blouse. She scanned the crowd for pity or scorn and found neither. Instead, the rancher stepped forward, brim brushing his chestnut hair. He offered his gloved hand to Clara. Silence cracked between them like a rifle shot. Clara placed the baby into his waiting arms, tears shining like dew in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered so softly only the wind could carry her words. He nodded once, wordless, and turned toward the livery stable beyond the fairgrounds. Clara followed, cloak swirling at her ankles. The infant stirred, a soft wail caught in afternoon light. The rancher strode with purpose, leading them to a battered wagon hitched to his bay mare. He lifted the child into the back and gestured for Clara to climb beside him, hand offering a simple bowl of water and fragments of stale bread from his coat pocket. She drank greedily, grateful for even crumbs. They rode west along a dusty trail, prairie grass bending beneath tire tracks. Clara watched the hills drift by, remembering the day her family drove cattle down the same path, before sickness stole her parents, leaving her orphan at 14 and forced to the road's mercy. The weight of each memory pressed her shoulders downward, but in the rancher's steady gaze, she found a fragile ember of hope. The mare's hooves fell in measured thuds, carrying them away from the auction block toward unknown refuge. After mile upon mile of sun-split expanse, the trail led to a homestead nestled in a shallow valley. Fences sagged beneath winter's frost. Barns leaned toward the ground as though weary. Smoke curled from the chimney of a single cabin with sagging eaves and windows like tired eyes. The rancher climbed down and carried the baby in his arms. Clara lowered herself into the dirt, boots sinking in dust. He introduced himself then, voice rough with disuse. Jacob Hayes. His jaw bore stubble matted by sweat and scars from a war. He spoke of only in the clench of his jaw and distant look in his eyes. Clara stood, drawing her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. She kept her gaze lowered, pressing her palms together against her skirts. Jacob reached out to set the baby in her arms, gently, as though placing a prayer onto her lap. "You rest," he said to Clara. "I'll tend the fire." His footsteps crunched toward the barn, leaving dust motes dancing in the cabin's plank floor. Clara listened to the quiet creak of logs settling under cold sky. She pressed the baby to her shoulder, humming a lullaby her mother once sang. Inside the cabin, Jacob stacked split logs under the hearth, kindling for the night's small blaze. He paused to stare out the window at the distant silhouette of a lone rider perched on the ridge, watching. The figure held a rifle across the saddle horn. Jacob's hand twitched near his holster. He remembered every skirmish at the front lines, when bullets sang hymns and men bled beneath sky. He gathered wood with measured calm, each log a promise that no harm would reach these two again. Dusk slipped across the valley, painting the walls of the cabin in flickering orange. Clara lit a lantern with trembling fingers. She set it upon a rough-hewn table beside a tin cup and a folded blanket Jacob had left there. Soft wool, a gift. She laid the blanket across the baby's thin form and brushed back wisps of hair from his brow. He blinked at the light, small hands flailing for warmth. Clara whispered, "You are safe?" Her voice broke on the last word, surrendering grief she thought long buried. The baby cooed, nestling deeper against her. Jacob returned with steaming broth in cracked bowls. He passed one to Clara and a ladleful to the baby, watching as the child drew nourishment from a rim. Flames crackled above them, and Clara felt a strange peace seep back into her bones. Jacob had placed a kettle of coffee on the stove, strong and bitter against her parched throat. He studied Clara's profile in the lantern glow, her hollow cheeks, her haunted eyes, and in his chest a new purpose pointed straight at her. Outside, a wolf's call curled over the prairie, a solitary note to warn of dangers beyond. Clara swayed on her stool, holding the baby as though cradling both past and future. Jacob moved to block the draft at the door, stepping into a web of night air. Clara followed a silhouette, voice soft as prayer. "Who watches us?" Jacob looked toward the ridge. The lone rider had vanished, leaving only hoofprints against the dusty grass. "Scouts," he said, tension taut in his shoulders. "I won't let them touch you." Clara pressed the child to her breast. His warmth pulsed through her like a sunrise. Everything she had lost trembled at the edges of her mind. Home, family, safety. Yet in these four walls, lit by fire and a stranger's mercy, she tasted something she had forgotten. Trust. She inhaled the scent of coffee and oak, of fresh linen and soft wool. Jacob returned and locked the door with a solid click. He slid a chair beside her, placing coffee within reach. He nodded once, a silent vow, and settled himself nearby, hand ready to defend. Through the haze of smoke and hundreds of unspoken words, they formed an unbreakable triangle. Two guardians, one fragile soul, bound by fate and the promise of sanctuary. Clara cradled her brother and met Jacob's steady gaze. The wind rattled distant fence posts, as if testing their new walls. Clara's voice trembled as she whispered a final prayer. We begin again. And beyond the cabin's thin walls, on the ridge where shadows danced, a figure watched with cold intent, an auctioneer's debt yet to be settled. Beyond these walls, night settled and distant hoofbeats whispered of choices to come. In the hush, Clara and Jacob found quiet courage to face dawn. Dawn crept through the cabin's single window, painting dust motes in pale gold. Clara pressed her hand to the baby's back, feeling the soft rise and fall of his tiny lungs. Outside, frost white as bone clung to fence rails, and the wind sighed through broken slats. Clara rose on careful feet, her shift whispering against the rough boards. She found water in a chipped tin cup by the pump and brought it inside, careful not to spill even a single drop. In the morning chill, every task felt vast, but she moved with steady purpose, guardian and sister combined in one fragile frame. She knelt by the hearth and stirred oatmeal in a cast-iron skillet. Steam swirled like mist over a mountain lake. The baby's coo drew her head forward, his eyes bright pools in the lamplit gloom. Clara ladled warm oats into another tin cup, then carried both bowls to a rough table. She sat and fed him spoonfuls, his small mouth opening trustingly. Each bite seemed to fill his cheeks and her heart with renewed hope. The cabin's silence hummed between mother and child, a lullaby of grain and quiet faith. Jacob chopped firewood just beyond the cabin door, his axe ringing against frost-hardened logs. Each strike was a drumbeat of purpose, echoing through the silent valley. He paused to survey the fields, brittle stalks bent beneath winter's first bite, and felt the ache of empty rows once planted for a family lost. He lifted a splintered plank from the porch and nodded to himself. He would mend his threshold next. His boots crunched across frozen ground as he stacked with neat rows, each log a pillar against cold nights and darker memories. He closed his eyes for a moment, recalling the battlefield's cratered soil. Gunfire had cracked the dawn like a whip. Mud had clung to uniforms as blood clung to hope. He had carried friends to safety and returned alone, each survivor's prayer a weight in his chest. In that memory lay every ache he bore, and every reason he sheltered Clara and the baby now. He exhaled, shoulders easing beneath loss's long shadow, and pressed on toward the porch with his bundle of kindling. Clara scooped crisp flour biscuits from a tin pail and arranged them on a wooden plank. Her hand shook with the memory of boarding-house breakfasts fed to creditors 3 years past, when her parents had lost their home to debt. She tasted sorrow in each crumb. Beside her, the baby gummed at his blanket's frayed edge, blinking awake to a world less cruel than the auction block. Clara brushed his hair back, palm gentle as prayer, and murmured promises no one would bargain away. She carried the plank outside, offering a biscuit to Jacob. He accepted it with a nod, tasting warmth and salt against his tongue. He held the bread like a lifeline and gestured with his eyes toward the fields. Without words, they shared morning's simple grace, 2 survivors bound by mercy's fragile thread. The baby gurgled, and Clara's chest loosened in a sigh. In that moment, she felt trust coil like new growth in frozen soil. Late morning found Clara sweeping fallen straw from the barn's creaking floor. Every sweep carried whispers of cattle lowing in summer past, and of her mother's apron brushing stanchions for calves. The baby lay safe in her lap, cooing at passing dust motes. Clara paused, letting sunlight kiss her face through a crack in the boards. She rubbed her arms against the chill and pressed lips to the baby's crown. "We're safe here, little one," she whispered, voice steady with vow. Jacob appeared with a coil of twine and a length of fresh lumber. He knelt beside Clara and demonstrated how to bind splintered boards with rough rope. The baby craned his neck, reaching for Jacob's strong hands. Clara followed each knot, guided by Jacob's calm steadiness. With each loop and pull, the fence healed beneath their hands. So, too, did something in Clara's guarded heart. The boundary they mended kept more than livestock in. It held promise of sanctuary. By midday, dust settled on the cabin floor, and cooling biscuits grew stale. Clara peered toward the ridge where the lone rider had watched them. Now, distant hoofbeats echoed across frozen fields, scouts circling like vultures. Jacob's hand dropped to the rifle at his hip. Clara's throat tightened. She recalled creditors' men who had once tracked her parents. The wind carried whispers of threat across the prairie, and Clara shivered in spite of Jacob's repaired cot waiting within. That afternoon, a wagon creaked down the lane. Mrs. Carson, the storekeeper, stepped from the wagon with a burlap sack of flour and a jar of syrup. Her bonnet's ribbon fluttered like a soft flag of mercy. She pressed a folded slip of paper into Jacob's hand. A note from Mr. Caldwell, demanding payment or removal within a week. Clara's pulse stuttered. Caldwell, the fiercest creditor in 3 counties, had haunted her dreams since childhood. She met Jacob's gaze. His eyes were dark wells of resolve. Mrs. Carson lingered, eyes gentle as dusk. "You too have a right to live," she said softly. "Use this to hold them off." She pointed to the note, then to the cabin. "We'll keep watch." Before they could speak, she climbed back into her wagon and eased away, leaving hoofprints in settling dust. Clara folded the paper with trembling fingers and pressed it into Jacob's coat pocket. In that silent exchange, they bore the weight of Caldwell's threat on their joined shoulders. Night fell as Clara settled the baby into his repaired cot. She draped her mother's shawl across his small frame and brushed her palm over each freckle on his arm. Jacob lit the lantern by the hearth and filled a tin cup with water. He knelt beside Clara, voice low as prayer. Tomorrow we face him. Clara swallowed fear as thick as treacle. She looked at the ridge, where the rider's silhouette had merged with twilight shadows. Her jaw set in defiance, and she whispered to the baby, "We stay, we fight." Outside, the wind rattled the fence they had mended, as though echoing their vow, and somewhere on the ridge, the lone rider watched and waited. Clara arose before sunrise, lantern light dancing on frost-rimed windows. She wrapped her mother's shawl tight around her shoulders, its wool rough but warm, and gathered the newborn in her arms. His small coo echoed in the quiet cabin as she carried him outside. The air bit at her cheeks, each breath a plume of promise. Beyond the porch, Jacob led a pair of shivering calves into barn, their faint bleats a dawn chorus. Clara set the baby on a bale of hay, then hefted a bucket of oats and scattered the feed into troughs. The calves nudged her skirt, and she laughed softly, relief blooming in her chest. Jacob stacked kindling beneath the hearth and returned to the corral's gap, where splintered rails and stray wires stood sentinel against winter's reach. He knelt in the frozen ground, knotting wire around a rough post. Clara knelt beside him, her fingers numb but sure as she followed his instructions. Each twist and pull mended the fence, and something in her heart, the baby wriggled from his perch, tiny fingers clutching at Clara's coat. She smiled down at him, brushing back wisps of hair with gentle care. Each coo begged for security. Clara pressed a finger into his hand, anchoring hope in the cold morning. As they worked, Clara's mind drifted to the night creditors ransacked her parents' store. She stood hidden behind barrels of molasses, watching men in black coats overturn shelves, their lanterns carving shadows into every corner. She remembered her mother's trembling voice, begging for mercy, and her father's hand guiding her away into the night. The memories stung like winter wind, but in Jacob's steady presence it softened. No longer a wound, but a lesson in survival. She exhaled through her nose, clearing frost from her breath, and tied the final knot. The rail held firm against her weight. Jacob rose, boots crunching tiny crystals beneath the fence line. He lifted a block of weathered wood and passed it to Clara, motioning to a gap too wide even for steady wire. Together they fitted the board, nails gleaming like morning stars as they tapped each fastener with careful precision. Jacob watched Clara's hands, calloused by labor yet tender in every gesture. In his chest stirred a memory of war, mud-churned fields at dawn, the stench of blood and cordite thicker than any winter frost. He had carried a wounded comrade across shell-torn earth, each step heavier than the last. That comrade's final words had been a plea to live on for those left behind. Jacob pressed a hand to his chest as he hammered, honoring the promise he made then, to protect life wherever he found it. By midday, the sun climbed above frosted ridges, and Clara guided a wheelbarrow of rocks to reinforce the corral's base. The baby sat on a quilt at her feet, grasping at pebbles with curious, chubby hands. He dropped one and giggled as it clicked against the wooden slats. Clara paused, her heart unwinding. In that tiny laugh she heard her mother's lullaby, a melody of grain and rain, and felt purpose in every note. She placed a pebble in her apron pocket, token of laughter's power. Jacob smiled, handing her a tin cup of water. She drank, the cold rushing through her, invigorating her resolve. Late afternoon found them under a sky bruised by clouds. A buckboard rattled down the lane, scouting Mr. Holder at the reins. His shoulders hunched against wind. He carried a crate of nails, fresh wire, and a sack of cornmeal. He tipped the battered hat to Clara and Jacob, his face maps of hardship. "Thought you might need a few extras," he said, voice rough as gravel. He pressed a folded note into Jacob's hand, a final demand from Mr. Caldwell, printed in harsh type. Pay by sunrise or lose the homestead. Clara's chest tightened. She lifted her eyes to Holder's. "Well, hold on," she said. He pressed a gloved hand to her shoulder, offering iron-shod reassurance. As dusk curled across the valley, Jacob led Clara to the barn loft. He produced an old pistol from his belt and a single tin can. "Time to learn," he said. Clara's stomach knotted. She had never fired a gun. The baby watched from Jacob's outstretched arms, eyes wide as lantern light. Jacob steadied Clara's elbow and guided her aim at the can perched on a rough stump. She closed one eye and squeezed the trigger. The report cracked like a whip through the still air. The can rocked, then fell with a hollow clatter. The baby cooed, small face lit with surprise. Clara lowered the pistol, breath catching in her throat. Jacob reached into his coat and withdrew a brass cavalry crest, his first earned in battle. He placed it in Clara's palm, its metal warm against her cold skin. "For courage," he whispered. Night deepened when two riders crept across the corral, lanterns glinting at waist level. Caldwell's men, their coats marked with a black C, slunk through the fence breach with wire cutters. Clara, armed with a pistol, stepped between them and the baby's crib. Jacob appeared behind her, rifle raised, eyes blazing. The intruders froze. One spat and hurled a folded letter onto the porch, a jagged warning to vacate by dawn or face ruin. They melted back into darkness, boots fading on frosted grass. Clara's pulse thundered. The fence, their labor hope, lay weakened once more. Before dawn's pale glow, Clara and Jacob paced the porch with Mr. Holder, summoned by Clara's soft whistle. Holder carried a lantern and extra wire cutters. They examined the cut rails, each snap plank a blow against sanctuary. Clara's hands trembled as she collected the letter's pieces from the floorboards. Jacob folded them into his jacket and met Holder's gaze. "They'll be back," he said. Holder nodded. "Then we'll be ready." He laid the circuit board of cut rails on a stump and began looping fresh wire. Clara wrapped the baby's shawl twice around her shoulders, tucking him against her chest. In the lantern's glow, she heard his gentle breath and felt his warmth coil around her heart. That morning at the rail fence, Sheriff Tom Miles rode up, badge shining beneath dawn's mist. He dismounted and approached Clara and Jacob with measured steps. In his hand, he held a ledger stamped paid in full. Clara's breath caught. He laid it on the rail, explaining neighbor contributions. Mrs. Carson's flower gift, Holder's nails, others' gold coins. Their collective mercy had cleared the debt. Clara's eyes brimmed as she cradled the baby, feeling the ledger's weight as both burden and relief. Sheriff Miles tipped his hat. "You're safe now," he said softly. But as their gratitude blossomed, distant hoofbeats thundered from the ridge. Clara's shawl snapped around her as the baby stirred wide-eyed. Jacob's hand went to his rifle. Sheriff Miles studied the horizon, tension tightening his jaw. Clara pressed the baby to her breast, mind coiling between hope and dread. Beyond the fence line, figures emerged through swirling dust, specters riding toward dawn's fragile promise. Hoofbeats thundered across frost-hardened earth as dawn's pale light stretched over the corral. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs like a runaway mare. She pressed the baby's shawl-wrapped form close, letting his tiny fingers curl around the fabric. Jacob stood at the cabin door, rifle leveled toward the ridge where dust spiraled like smoke. Clara touched the brass cavalry crest pinned to her bodice, Jacob's gift and her pledge to stand. In the hush before confrontation, wind moaned through broken boards, carrying warning of moments to come. Jacob heaped split logs beside the hearth, then paused to study Clara's stance. "We fortify," he said, voice rough as creek gravel. He placed heavy iron bars across the shutters, each clank echoing the memory of rifle fire on distant battlefields. Clara sank rivets into door planks, hammer ringing like a warning bell. The baby's soft coos mingled with metal song, a fragile counterpoint of life amid threat. Clara watched Jacob's broad shoulders as he braced logs at the threshold, each beam a promise against despair. As Jacob stepped back to measure their work, Clara patrolled the perimeter, pistol at her hip. She followed hoofprints that led nowhere, recalling the night creditors ransacked her parents' store. She had hidden in the loft, sponge in hand, listening to their boots clatter over glass jars and the hiss of spilled grain. A lantern swing had nearly revealed her. She had pressed herself into shadows until dawn's mercy. Now, each frozen blade of grass carried memory and resolve. She would not cower again. Jacob found her by the eastern fence, lantern pocketed and eyes distant. He knelt to coax a skittish filly into its stall, low voice soothing as a hymn. Clara knelt beside him, pressing the baby's cheek to the mare's side, sharing heat through patched wool. The filly nuzzled the infant's shawl, and Clara exhaled in wonder at small trust. Jacob saw tears glint on Clara's lashes, grief's thaw, and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Together they guided the mare, a silent testament to bonds forged in hardship. Mid-morning brought Mr. Holder's creaking wagon back down the lane. He delivered a crate of spare hinges and fresh wire, his eyes kind beneath steel-gray brows. "Neighbors, rally," he said softly, pressing a handful of gold coins into Jacob's palm. Mrs. Carson gathered donations at the store. "Sheriff Miles vouched for you." Clara watched Jacob's jaw loosen in reluctant gratitude. Holder tipped his hat and drove off, leaving the warmth of goodwill in his wake. Clara pressed coins to her heart, a lifeline of community amid the wilderness. They returned to Barnes' lean-to, securing spare boards and ropes for last resort. Clara's breasts ached with milk. She cradled the baby against her heart and closed her eyes. Jacob watched her, recalling a comrade's cry as he carried him through smoke and ash. The comrade had died in his arms, mouth pressed against his uniform in final plea for life. Jacob had whispered solace he did not believe. Now he murmured vow to Clara and her brother that no child would die for lack of mercy on his watch. By afternoon, Caldwell's men appeared on a rise, coats black as ravens' wings. They dismounted with nippers and saws, moving to the fence's weakest points. Clara retrieved her pistol, voice steady as steel. "Stand back!" The men paused, sneers flickering under sun-bleached hats. Jacob stepped forward, rifle resting on his hip. "Leave our fence," he demanded. One man spat and struck the rail with nippers, sparks dancing like gunfire. Clara tightened her grip on the pistol's barrel, ready to defend in silence's breath. When the first rail fell, Jacob lunged, placing his body between men and baby. He raised his rifle, but did not fire. Clara's chest tightened as she grasped the crest at her throat, recalling its weight in her palm. She stepped beside Jacob and leveled the pistol, finger trembling on the trigger. "One more move," she warned, "and I'll protect my brother." The men froze at that unblinking silence, then retreated to the ridge in sudden disarray, muttering threats as dust swallowed their path. Clara's breath sounded in her ears. She fell into Jacob's side, relief and fury tangled in her bones. Evening shadows pooled beneath the cabin as Mrs. Carson approached with a tin basin of hot stew. She braved the empty tracks and set the basin on a barrel. "Fortify what you can," she said, eyes bright with defiance. "Caldwell fancies law, but neighbors know justice." She paused, laying a hand on Clara's shawl. "I've fetched more wire and your mother's old quilt for drafting a plan." Clara nodded, gratitude blooming like wildflowers in spring. Mrs. Carson's lantern beam faded down the lane, leaving hope glimmering in its wake. Under lantern light, Clara and Jacob mapped the fence on a scrap of paper, stockpiling water barrels, setting traps at the fence, planting sentries at the gate. The baby slept in his cot, shawl tucked around him like armor. Jacob studied plans with fierce calm. "At first light," he said, "we draw the line." Clara pressed the crest of her heart and fingered the braid of her mother's shawl. She felt the warmth of promise in every thread, trust woven from loss and shared refuge. Night deepened when Caldwell's foreman reappeared at the door, knuckles rasping on wood. Clara stood guard, pistol drawn. Jacob loosed a bolt. Caldwell's lean silhouette filled the frame, his eyes cold as winter clay. "I come for compliance," he said, boots thudding on the threshold. "Or for your heads." A gust rattled the shutters. The baby stirred, tiny fists curling around Clara's shift. Clara met Caldwell's gaze, voice firm as canyon stone. We comply with no cruelty. Outside, the wind carried word of more hoofbeats. New riders closing in across frozen plain. Clara's pistol lowered but did not waver. Jacob stepped forward, shoulders squared like an arrow knock. Caldwell studied them both, scowl deepening with grudging respect. "Tomorrow," he hissed, "I return with lawmen, then you'll yield." He turned away, boots echoing like thunder on the boards. Clara closed the door and bolted it, breathing out a prayer. She pressed her cheek to the baby, whose gentle coo hammered hope into her soul. Jacob crossed the stand at her side, hand resting on the rifle. They listened to hoofbeats recede, replaced by wind's lament through the eaves. Clara wrapped the baby tighter, eyes shining with defiance. Jacob drew her into a quiet embrace, the crest warm against her chest. In that hush, they felt the fragile pulse of family beating against cruelty's edge. Dawn would bring reckoning. Against Caldwell, against the lawless frontier. Clara laid a hand on Jacob's scarred cheek, voice low as promise. "We stand together." Beyond the cabin, shadows shifted, and riders pressed closer, bearing threats and uncertain mercy in equal measure. Hoofbeats thundered against the frozen ground, each strike a summons to reckoning. Clara pressed the baby's shawl-clad form against her chest, feeling his quick breath tickle her skin. Jacob stepped into the lantern's glow, rifle shouldered with steady resolve. Beyond the fence, Caldwell's riders dismounted in a cloud of dust, coats buttoned against the wind. The foreman's boot heel clicked on corral rails as he drew a pistol, shadowed by 3 uniformed deputies from the county. Clara's pulse surged, a drumbeat of defiance. The moment of truth had come. Caldwell's foreman spat into the dust. "We've waited long enough," he snarled. "You'll yield the ranch or we'll seize it by law." His voice crackled like dry tinder. Jacob squared his shoulders against the threat, rifle barrel leveled but lowered. Clara rose beside him, pistol clasped firm in her hand. The brass crest at her collar caught lantern light, gleaming like a promise. "This home's paid for in sweat and kindness," Jacob said, voice low as canyon wind. "It isn't yours for the taking." His words carried the weight of every lost comrade's prayer for life. A murmur ran through Caldwell's men as Sheriff Tom Miles rode up, badge glinting beneath frost-rimed harness. He raised a hand, calling for calm. "Gentlemen," he said, voice carrying authority earned on dusty trails. He held aloft a stamped ledger, Caldwell's claim marked, "Paid in full." The foreman's sneer faltered. "This is," he stammered, but Miles cut him off. "Neighbors contributed gold and grain," the sheriff explained, eyes sweeping over the riders. "They stood for justice." Beyond Caldwell, Clara spotted Mr. Holder leaning from his buckboard, pitchfork in hand, and neighbors emerging from barns with lanterns and rifles. Silent witnesses turned allies. Caldwell's foreman ground his heel into the dirt. "This is trickery," he spat. One deputy advanced, but Miles stepped between them. "Your law ends where community begins," he said, palm flat at collarbone. Jacob felt Clara's small hand slip into his, her grip fierce with gratitude. In that shared pulse, he remembered his comrade's last whisper, to protect those unable to protect themselves. He raised his rifle, not to fire, but to show he would stand his ground. The deputies exchanged glances, murmurs of unease passing like wind through prairie grass. Clara watched as Caldwell's men drooped beneath the weight of moral defeat. One tossed his nippers aside, the others back toward their horses. Caldwell's foreman squared his shoulders once more, face set in stubborn pride. He spat again, dust rising in lazy spirals. "This isn't over," he vowed. Then he mounted his horse and spurred away, deputies in his wake. The hoofbeats faded, leaving the ranch in quiet triumph. Clara exhaled, relief and adrenaline twinged in her limbs. She lowered her pistol and hugged her brother close, feeling his small heartbeat against her own. As dawn's first pale light filled the valley, Mrs. Carson arrived with steaming coffee and enamel mugs and fresh biscuits wrapped in linen. She set them on a barrel beside the cabin door, filling the air with the scent of bacon grease and hope. Mr. Holder came to her side, offering a burlap sack of flour. Neighbors lifted splintered rails and hammered fresh nails under Jacob's direction, each strike a benediction. Clara watched them move as if in prayer, the weakened fence rising whole again. In every pad of wood and loop of wire, she felt the promise of chosen family taking root. Jacob bent beside Clara, his breath steamy in morning chill. He lifted the baby onto her hip, tucking the fringe of her mother's shawl around his shoulders. The child gurgled, waving a pudgy fist. Clara laughed, a sound bright as meadow lark song. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the pebbles she'd gathered, token of laughter's power, and placed it in the baby's chubby palm. He grasped it tight, a pact of resilience in small stone. Jacob laid a hand on Clara's shoulder, voice hushed with wonder. "You've given him life," he said, "and given us purpose, too." At midday, Sheriff Miles guided Jacob and Clara to the cabin's threshold. He tipped his hat and shared a final word. "Keep this welcome as fiercely as you fought for it." He nodded to neighbors, then rode away, deputies trailing behind. The yard settled into calm, the only sound of hammers ring and a child's soft coos. Clara watched the sheriff's dust trail vanish beyond the ridge and felt a gentle tremor of gratitude for mercy's slow justice. Evening fell in rose and gold, and Clara lit the lantern by the porch. Jacob gathered the last of splintered wood, stacking it neat as carved pillars. He paused to set a battered tin cup on the rail, a silent salute to the fight they'd won. Clara crossed to him, tucking the baby into his arms. She traced her finger over the crest of her throat, then lifted her mother's shawl to wrap around them both. In that gesture lay every promise made beneath harsh skies. Under starlit glow, neighbors drifted toward the barn, carrying lanterns and blankets for a first watch. Clara took up the rifle at Jacob's side, her silhouette strong against the tender light. She felt the weight of her parents' memory in each heartbeat, tempered now by guardianship. The baby drifted to sleep against Jacob's chest, shawl entwined around her fingers. Clara laid her cheek on her brother's head, her heart pulsing in time with his gentle breath. Morning broke with sky brushed in pink and promise. Clara knelt in the furrowed earth, planting corn seeds saved from Mrs. Carson's gift. Jacob beside her pressed soil over each kernel, their hands moving in wordless harmony. The baby sat in the shade of a newly mended fence, grasping a blade of grass and laughing as it tickled his palm. Neighbors tapped boards back into place and raised a new windbreak of posts and rope. In the hush of early sun, Clara felt something tender bloom, hope. As corn stalks swayed in the breeze, Jacob stood and lifted Clara into a quiet embrace. He brushed her hair from her face, voice soft with promise. "We are family now," he murmured. Clara nodded, baby's coo pressing warm through her. In the distance, the ridge lay silent, a sentinel to battles fought and peace won. Clara dusted earth from her skirts, then lifted her shawl to catch sun's first rays. Jacob placed a cavalry crest in her palm once more, its polished curve reflecting dawn's gold. They walked back to the cabin, the baby toddling behind, holding Clara's hem with one small hand and the pebble in the other. In the doorframe they paused, three silhouettes against morning light. Orphan, infant, and soldier turned guardian. Clara tucked the shawl around her brother's shoulders, saluting their shared journey from auction block to home. Jacob locked the door against winter's breath and flipped the latch. Clara touched the grain of the wood, lips brushing the crest around her neck. In that quiet moment, through frost-kissed dawn and embers of conflict, they found sanctuary. Corn seed nestled in dark soil, new fence bled warmth into cold field, and a chosen family rose from dust and despair, resilient, hopeful, forever bound beneath the wide prairie sky.